The dogs had velvet cushions. She had the cold stone floor. And the Duke of Ashmore never once looked up from his letter. Later, much later, people would say that was the moment everything began. Not with a grand gesture, not with a declaration, not with the kind of dramatic scene that fills the pages of novels. Just a woman standing in a room where even the animals were seated. Just a man who couldn't be bothered to notice. But here is what those people didn't know. She noticed everything. And she remembered every single detail. The color of the cushions, the scratch of his pen, the exact angle of his jaw when he finally looked up and decided she wasn't worth his time. 3 years is a long time to remember. 3 years is also a long time to change. This is the story of Elinor Voss, a widow with nothing left to lose, a duke with everything left to learn, and the moment one man's carelessness became the very thing that undid him. The morning Elinor Voss arrived at Ashmore Estate, it was raining. Not the gentle, poetic kind of rain that softens the edges of things. The kind that soaks through wool and turns gravel paths into rivers, and makes a woman deeply regret wearing her last good pair of shoes. She had walked the final quarter-mile herself. The hired coach had stopped at the gates, the driver eyeing the private road with the particular reluctance of a man who understood very clearly that this was not his world, and that wheels like his were not meant on gravel like that. Elinor had thanked him, stepped out and walked. She was good at that by now. Stepping into places she wasn't certain she was welcome, and walking as though she was. She was 26 years old. She had been a wife for 3 years and a widow for 7 months. In those 7 months she had sold her jewelry, her husband's books, his horse, and the small writing desk she had loved more than almost anything else she owned. She had moved from their townhouse in Bath to 2 rented rooms above a baker's shop, where the smell of bread came through the floors every morning and almost made things feel bearable. She had done all of this without crying in front of anyone. She was not going to start today. The letter she carried had been written by her husband, Thomas, 6 weeks before he died. She had found it tucked inside the lining of his good coat, folded so many times it had gone soft at the creases, as though he had opened and closed it 100 times before deciding what to do with it. If something happens to me, he had written, go to Ashmore. Go to the Duke. Tell him I sent you. He will understand. Elinor had stared at those words for a long time. Thomas had not been a man who asked for help easily. He had not been a man who admitted weakness, or debt, or the particular quiet terror of a household slowly sinking beneath the weight of money that wasn't there. She had known, of course. She had always known, in the way that wives know things their husbands believe they are hiding, but she had never pushed. She had managed the household accounts, stretched what there was and said nothing. She had loved him. Not in the breathless, consuming way of romantic novels. In the steadier, quieter way of 2 people who have decided to be kind to each other and have mostly managed it. She missed him more than she had expected to. And she was here because he had asked her to be. Because it was the last thing he had asked of her, and she was not the kind of woman who left things undone. The butler who opened the door looked at her the way people had been looking at her for 7 months, with that particular blend of pity and calculation that the respectable reserve for the recently fallen. He assessed her coat, her shoes, the absence of a carriage, the presence of mud on her hem. Mrs. Voss, she said before he could speak. The Duke is expecting me. He was not expecting her. She knew that. But she had written ahead 3 weeks ago, requesting an appointment, and no one had written back to say no. Silence, she had learned, was not always a refusal. The butler showed her to a sitting room, not the formal receiving room, she noted, but a smaller one off the main corridor, the kind of room where the furniture was older and the fire had not yet been lit that morning. She sat. She waited. Outside the tall windows, the rain continued its work on the gardens with businesslike efficiency. 20 minutes passed, then 30. At the 40-minute mark, a footman appeared and said, with great courtesy and very little apology, that His Grace would see her now. The study was warm. That was the first thing she noticed: warmth, real warmth, the kind that comes from a fire that has been burning for hours and a room that has been lived in and not merely maintained. Books on every surface, maps on the walls, a large oak desk positioned to catch the morning light from 2 tall windows. The second thing she noticed was the dogs. 2 of them, large, rust-colored hounds, stretched across a settee near the fireplace, occupying it entirely, their long legs dangling off the edge with the boneless ease of animals that have never in their lives been asked to make room for anyone. The settee had cushions. Deep, rich, burgundy velvet cushions, slightly flattened from use. There were no other chairs. The Duke of Ashmore sat behind his desk. He did not stand. He did not look up. He was perhaps 35, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, the kind of man whose physical presence fills a room in a way that has nothing to do with height and everything to do with certainty. The certainty of a man who has never walked into a space and wondered whether he belonged there. He was reading a letter, or pretending to. Elinor had dealt with enough powerful men in the past 7 months to know the difference. As she stood, she was not offered a seat. The settee was occupied. The desk chair was his. There was simply nothing, just the stone floor beneath her feet, still slightly damp at the hem of her dress, and the warmth of a fire she had not been invited to stand near. She waited. The Duke turned a page. One of the dogs sighed in its sleep. A long, contented, deeply comfortable sigh. Elinor looked at the dog, then at the cushion beneath it. Then she looked back at the Duke of Ashmore, who was still reading his letter, and she thought, with a calm she was mildly proud of, "I see. Mrs. Voss," he said it the way one reads a name off a list. Identifying, not greeting. "Your Grace," she kept her voice level. Warm even. She had practiced this. He set down the letter and looked at her. Directly, thoroughly, the way men like him looked at things they were deciding the value of. She let him look. She was good at that too. "You wrote to me," he said. "I did, regarding Thomas Voss." "Yes," a pause. He leaned back in his chair. "Thomas Voss is dead, Mrs. Voss. I'm aware of that, Your Grace. I was his wife." Something shifted in his expression, barely, just a degree, and then settled back into its original arrangement. Polite. Distant. Closed. "He owed money," the Duke said. "A significant amount. To several people, as I understand it. He did. And you've come to me because," he paused, as though giving her space to explain herself. As though this were a kindness. Elinor kept her hands still in her lap. She had written a careful speech. Logical, brief, unemotional. Thomas had spoken of the Duke as a fair man once, and she had chosen to believe that. She had explained it clearly in her letter. Not charity, simply a request for intercession with one particular creditor, a man who had been a business associate of the Duke's, and who had the power to ruin what little remained of Thomas's name and her own ability to earn a living. She opened her mouth to begin. "I don't involve myself in dead men's debts," he said it quietly, almost gently. And then he looked back down at his letter. The dismissal was so complete, so absolute, that for a moment Elinor simply stood there, not from weakness, but from the pure, startling efficiency of it. 7 words. Not even a full sentence of consideration. The footman appeared at the door. He had been waiting, she realized. Just outside. He had known before she had how this would end. She turned to go. At the door, the threshold, she stopped. She did not know afterward exactly why she stopped. Perhaps it was the warmth of the room she was about to leave. Perhaps it was 7 months of silent endurance pressing at the back of her throat. Perhaps it was simply that she had walked a quarter mile in the rain for this, and some part of her required one moment, just one, of being seen before she walked back out of it. She turned. The Duke of Ashmore was reading his letter. The dogs slept on their velvet cushions. The fire crackled. She looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. He did not look up. Then she left. She was halfway down the gravel drive. The rain had stopped at least, though the damage to her shoes was already done, when she heard quick footsteps behind her. She turned and found not the footman but the Duke's elderly steward, a small, neat man with kind eyes and an expression of careful neutrality. He held out a small envelope. Plain. Unsealed. Her name written on the front in an old man's careful hand, not the Duke's. From whom? She asked. The steward glanced back at the house. His Grace's father, he said quietly, wrote that some weeks before he passed. He asked me to give it to you should you ever come. Elinor looked at the envelope. He knew I would come. He hoped you wouldn't need to, the steward said. And then, with a small bow that felt more genuine than anything she had received inside the house, he turned and walked back up the drive. Elinor stood alone on the wet gravel. She looked down at the envelope in her hands. She did not open it. Not yet. She tucked it carefully inside her coat, against her chest, next to Thomas's letter which she still carried everywhere, folded soft at the creases, and she began to walk. She had a long way to go. And she had a great deal to think about. She was sitting at the small table in her 2 rooms above the baker's shop, still in her damp dress, because she hadn't had the energy yet to change. A single candle burning between her and the rain-spotted window. The bread smell had come up through the floorboards as it always did, warm, yeasty, relentless, and she had eaten half a piece of cold cheese and called it dinner. She had been putting the envelope off for 6 hours. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps because Thomas's letter had already changed everything once, and she wasn't certain she had the reserves left for another change tonight. She opened it. It was short. 3 sentences, in that same careful, elderly hand. Your husband was a good man who was placed in an impossible position by people more powerful than himself. The debt you carry is not yours. My son does not yet know what I know, but one day he will need to, and when that day comes, I hope you will still be standing. Below that, a signature. Edward Cavendish, Duke of Ashmore. The father, not the son. Elinor read it 3 times. Then she folded it, carefully, along its original creases, and placed it beside Thomas's letter in the small tin box she kept under the loose floorboard beneath her bed. She sat for a long time in the candlelight. Then she stood up, changed out of her damp dress, and went to sleep. In the morning, she had made a decision. She was going to stop waiting for powerful men to decide her fate. She was going to build something of her own. It started with the dressmaker on Pulteney Street. Mrs. Hale was 60 years old, half-blind in one eye, and possessed of a temper that had driven away 3 apprentices in as many years. She also had more orders than she could fill, and a particular weakness for anyone who could draw a clean line. Elinor could draw a clean line. She had always been able to. It was one of those small, unremarkable talents that had never seemed important until suddenly it was. She had spent her marriage sketching patterns on the backs of household ledgers, designing dresses she couldn't afford, reworking the ones she had to make them look like something they weren't. She knocked on Mrs. Hale's door with a folder of drawings and the specific, focused calm of a woman who understood she had exactly one chance to make this work. Mrs. Hale looked at the drawings for a long time. "These are good," she said, in the tone of someone who found the fact mildly irritating. "Yes," Alina said. She started the following Monday. The first year was hard in the specific, grinding way that honest work is hard: early mornings, late nights, hands that ached from holding pencils and pins, a kind of tiredness that sat in the bones rather than the muscles. But it was a clean tiredness, the kind that came from building rather than enduring. She learned quickly. Within 6 months, she was not just drawing patterns but improving them, adjusting proportions, solving the small structural problems that made the difference between a dress that fit and a dress that sang. Mrs. Hale, who had never in her life paid a compliment she didn't feel was absolutely necessary, told her once, just once, at the end of a very long day, that Alina had an eye for it. Alina took that and held it close for weeks. By the end of the first year, she had saved enough to move out of the rooms above the baker's and into a small, clean cottage at the edge of town, with a room she could use as a workroom. By the end of the second year, she had 3 private clients of her own, women who had heard, quietly, through the particular channels that women use to pass important information between themselves, that there was a widow in Bath who could make something extraordinary out of almost nothing. She was not yet prosperous, but she was, for the first time in years, stable. And stability, Alina had learned, was its own kind of wealth. It was in the third year that things changed. A client, Lady Portman, wife of a minor baronet with a very large social ambition, wore one of Alina's designs to a gathering in London and was asked, by 4 separate women who had made it. Lady Portman gave Alina's name. Within a month, Alina had letters from London. Within 2 months, she had traveled there twice, measured 6 new clients in borrowed rooms, and been offered the use of a small shopfront on a good street by a landlord who had a wife with excellent taste and a practical understanding of who would soon be in demand. She took it. Vase, she called the shop. Just that. Simple. Clean. Her name, which had once felt like a weight, worn now as something else entirely. By the winter of 1818, women in London were saying quietly, then less quietly, that Mrs. Vase had an instinct that couldn't be taught. That her dresses didn't just fit the body, they understood it. That to wear something from Vase was to feel, for a few hours, like the best version of yourself. Alina heard these things secondhand. She was usually too busy to attend the gatherings where they were said. She worked. She built. She kept Thomas's letters and the old Duke's note in their tin box, and she did not think about Ashmore. Or she tried not to. She was in the shop on a Tuesday morning in November, pinning a length of deep green silk to a dress form, the kind of work that required just enough concentration to be satisfying, when her assistant, a sharp-eyed girl named Polly, appeared in the doorway with an expression Alina recognized. It was the expression of someone who had just seen something interesting and was deciding how to present it. "There's a gentleman outside," Polly said. "Tell him we don't dress gentlemen. He's not here to be dressed." A pause. "He's been standing across the street for about 10 minutes. Just looking at the shop." Alina did not look up from the silk. "Then he can continue to look at it from across the street." Polly hesitated. "He's very well dressed. Most men who stand across streets looking at things are." Another hesitation. Then carefully, "I think it might be Lord Harwick." Alina's hands went still. Just for a moment. One breath, too, and then she was moving again, smoothing the silk, adjusting a pin, her face entirely composed. "Close the curtain on the front window," she said quietly. "Mrs. Vase, please, Polly." Polly went. Alina stood very still at the dress form and thought about Lord Harwick, which was something she did not often permit herself to do. It was like pressing a bruise, There was a dark satisfaction in knowing exactly where it hurt, but it didn't help anything. She had been 22 when she married Thomas. Harwick had already been circling him by then, a predator with exceptional manners and a gift for appearing helpful at precisely the moments when helpfulness could do the most damage. He had offered Thomas investments, introductions, opportunities that looked like gifts and functioned like traps. Thomas had been a good man who was not, perhaps, a shrewd one. By the time Elinor understood what Harwick was, it was too late for Thomas. The debts were already real, the reputation already fraying at the edges, the position already impossible to recover from, and Harwick had moved on to his next project with the easy efficiency of someone who has never once lost sleep over the wreckage he leaves behind. She had never been able to prove any of it. She had never spoken of it publicly. But she had the old Duke's note. And she had Thomas's letters, all of them, not just the ones she'd found in the coat, but the ones she'd discovered later, tucked in various places around the house as though Thomas had been slowly assembling evidence he hadn't quite known what to do with. She had kept all of it. She had never known exactly why. Now, standing in her own shop with her own name on the door, she wondered if some part of her had always known that eventually, it would matter. That evening, she received a different visitor. She was locking up, Polly already gone home, the shop quiet and dim in the early winter dark, when a carriage stopped in the street outside. Not an unusual occurrence. The street was busy, but this one sat there without moving, the horses patient, a footman standing at the door with an expression of concentrated neutrality. Elinor recognized the crest on the carriage door. She stood very still. The footman crossed the street and handed her a note. She took it. Read it. Read it again. Mrs. Voss, I find myself in need of a conversation. The matter concerns a mutual acquaintance, and is rather more urgent than I am comfortable admitting in writing. I am aware this is irregular. I am aware, also, that I have given you no reason to grant me any courtesy whatsoever. Ashmore. Elinor read the note a third time. Then she folded it, tucked it into her pocket, and looked at the footman. Tell his grace, she said pleasantly, that I am unavailable this evening. The footman blinked. He is in the carriage, madam. Just there, yes, said Elinor. I know. She pulled on her gloves, turned, and walked in the opposite direction. Behind her, she heard nothing for a long moment. Then the sound of a carriage door opening. She didn't turn around. Mrs. Voss, his voice. Deeper than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply not been paying close enough attention 3 years ago. She had been focused on other things that day. She stopped. She did not turn around. I need your help, he said. And then, after a pause that sounded like it cost him something, please. The street was quiet around them. A few passers-by. Gas lamps just beginning to glow in the early dark. Elinor stood with her back to the Duke of Ashmore and thought about a cold stone floor, and a settee with burgundy velvet cushions, and 2 dogs sleeping in the warmth of a fire she hadn't been invited to stand near. She thought about Thomas, about Harwick, standing across the street that morning with his excellent manners and his exceptional damage. She thought about an old man's 3 sentences. I hope you will still be standing. She was. She turned around. The Duke of Ashmore looked, and this was the only word for it, diminished. Not physically. He was still broad-shouldered and dark-haired and possessed of that particular certainty that wealthy men carry in their posture. But there was something around the eyes. Something that had not been there 3 years ago, when she had been a problem he could dismiss in 7 words. He looked like a man who had recently understood something he wished he hadn't had to. Elinor looked at him for a long moment. My shop opens at 9, she said. I will see you at 9:30. You will wait until I am ready. She did not wait for his answer. She walked home through the gas-lit streets of London, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, not even satisfaction. Something quieter than that. Something that felt, strangely, like the beginning of things finally moving in the right direction. She still had the tin box under the floorboard. She thought it was almost time to open it again. She was already at work when he arrived. That was intentional. Elinor had been at the shop since 2 hours before she told him, because she had learned long ago that the best way to meet a powerful man on your own terms was to already be doing something when he walked in. To already be in motion. To make it clear without saying a word that his arrival was a detail in your morning rather than the point of it. She was at the dress form when Polly showed him in, deep in the problem of a sleeve. A particular client had narrow shoulders and strong opinions, a difficult combination, and she did not look up immediately. She gave it 4 seconds. Then she set down her pins, smoothed her hands on her apron and turned. He had taken off his hat. That was the first thing she noticed. He was holding it in both hands in a way that men like him rarely held anything, with a kind of careful, effortful humility, as though he had reminded himself to do it and was concentrating on following through. He looked around the shop once, quickly, taking it in. She watched him take it in. She had worked hard on this space. Clean lines, good light. The particular quiet confidence of a room that knows exactly what it is. Her name on the wall in simple lettering. Bolts of fabric arranged by color. Everything precise, considered, earned. She watched him understand that. "Your Grace," she said. "Mrs. Voss," he met her eyes. "Thank you for seeing me. You said it was urgent. It is." She gestured toward the 2 chairs near the window, proper chairs. She had made certain of that when she furnished this room. Chairs for everyone who came through the door regardless of why they'd come, and sat in one. He sat in the other. Polly disappeared with the wordless efficiency Elinor had spent 2 years teaching her. He talked for a long time. Elinor listened. She was good at listening, genuinely good, not in the polite, performative way of women who have been trained to appear interested, but in the real way, the way that catches the thing beneath the thing being said. She listened to the words, and she listened to the pauses between them, and she listened to the particular quality of a proud man's voice when he is forcing himself to be honest. The story came out in pieces, not entirely in order, the way true things usually do. Lady Cecily Wren, 20 years old, the daughter of Viscount Wren, presented to him last spring at a gathering he had attended largely out of obligation. Pretty bright, eager to please in a way he had found charming initially and then, later, slightly troubling, though he hadn't been able to articulate why until recently. The engagement had been announced 6 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, he had discovered that Cecily's family had been in private correspondence with Lord Harwick for over a year before the introduction was arranged. Elinor's hands were still in her lap. She said nothing. Harwick, the Duke continued, had significant interest in 3 parcels of land on the eastern edge of the Ashmore estate, land that had been disputed for years, that the Duke's father had fought for, and won. That was worth more than it appeared because of what lay beneath it. Harwick had tried to acquire it legally twice and failed. He had tried other methods. The Duke paused here carefully and failed those too. The engagement, the Duke now believed, was Harwick's 3rd attempt. Cecily's family was in debt to Harwick. The marriage, once completed, would give Harwick legal leverage over the estate through a series of financial arrangements buried in the settlement documents. Arrangements the Duke's solicitor had only recently found, hidden in the language of clauses that were designed to look routine. He planned it for over a year, the Duke said. At least, Elinor said. He looked at her. "Lord Harwick," she said, "planned my husband's ruin for closer to 3. The silence between them shifted. It was a different kind of silence now. Not the silence of a man who has said his piece and is waiting, but the silence of a man who is beginning to understand the full shape of something he had previously only seen a corner of. "Tell me," he said quietly. So she did. She had not told this story to anyone before. Not in its entirety. She had told pieces of it to herself mostly in the small hours of the night, working through it the way you work through a knot, slowly, patiently, until you understand exactly how it was tied. She told it now without emotion, or with the specific kind of controlled emotion that is perhaps more devastating than tears. The flat, precise recounting of a woman who has had 3 years to understand exactly what happened and is no longer frightened of any of it. Thomas had met Harwick through a business introduction in 1811. Harwick had cultivated the friendship carefully over years, invitations, connections, the gradual accumulation of small favors that became large obligations before Thomas had quite noticed the change. By 1813, Thomas was financially entangled with Harwick in ways that looked, from the outside, like ordinary business arrangements, and were in practice a series of elegant traps. Each time Thomas tried to extract himself, Harwick found a way to make extraction more costly than compliance. Thomas had started writing things down in 1814. Not quite evidence, he hadn't been certain enough, or perhaps hadn't wanted to be, but records. Dates, conversations, transactions. The letters Eleanor had found in the house after he died. "He was building something," she said. "I think he intended to go to someone with it. Someone with enough power to act on it. He was going to come to me," the Duke said. Eleanor looked at him. "My father," the Duke said. "He told me, shortly before he died, that Thomas Voss had written to him. That there was something I needed to know about Harwick. I didn't," he stopped. His jaw tightened. "I didn't pursue it. There was a great deal happening with the estate, and I thought," he stopped again. "You thought it could wait," Eleanor said. Yes, the word sat between them. Eleanor thought about Thomas's letter, tucked in the coat lining. "If something happens to me." As though he had known. As though he had understood, by the end, exactly how things were going to go, and had done the only thing he could think of, pointed her toward the one place he'd hoped might help. She had walked through the rain for that. She had stood on a cold stone floor for that. She had been dismissed in 7 words for that. She looked at the Duke of Ashmore, and she felt not anger exactly. Something older and more tired than anger. Something that had been sitting in her chest for 3 years and was now, finally, in the presence of the person it had been waiting for, beginning to release. "I have the letters," she said. He went very still. "All of them. Everything Thomas recorded. Dates, names, amounts. 3 years of Harwick's methods, documented by the man he used them on." She held his gaze. "I didn't know what to do with them. I didn't have the connections to act on them myself. And I had no reason," she said carefully, "to trust that anyone with enough power to act on them would bother." The Duke closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. It wasn't quite guilt. Guilt was too simple for it. It was more like the specific reckoning of a man who has just seen, clearly and completely, the full consequences of a single morning's carelessness. "I know," he said, "that I have no right to ask you for anything." "No," she agreed. "You don't, and I know that what I'm about to ask is considerable." "Yes," a pause. "Will you help me anyway?" Eleanor stood up. She crossed to her work table, opened the second drawer, and removed a small flat tin box. She had brought it from Bath when she moved to London. She had not opened it since. She set it on the table between them and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him. There are conditions, she said. Name them. The letters go to your solicitor. Not to you. Directly to him, with a full accounting of their origin and provenance. Thomas's name is part of the record, not as a debtor, not as a victim, but as the man who documented this. He is not erased from this. Agreed. Harwick is dealt with through proper legal channels. You have enough power to make this quiet and convenient. I don't want quiet. I want it done correctly. Agreed. And Lady Cecily Eleanor paused. She is not ruined by this. Whatever her family's involvement, she is 20 years old and she was a tool, not an architect. She is treated accordingly. Something in the Duke's expression shifted, surprised, perhaps, that this was on her list. Agreed, he said more quietly. Eleanor nodded once. She picked up the tin box and held it out. He reached for it, and then stopped, his hand an inch from hers, and looked at her. Mrs. Voss, he said. I owe you an apology. You owe me several. Yes, he didn't look away. I do. And I intend to make them. Properly. When this is finished and you have more reason to believe they are genuine. A pause. If you will allow it. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she placed the tin box in his hands. Finish this first, she said. It took 6 weeks. Eleanor was not involved in most of it. That was by design, hers as much as his. She had her shop, her clients, the particular focused rhythm of a life she had built herself, and she was not going to disrupt it for a legal proceeding, however satisfying. But she heard things. Polly heard things and reported them with the detailed enthusiasm of someone who had fully understood, without being told, that this mattered. Harwick's solicitor withdrew from the case in the 2nd week, a significant signal, in legal circles, of rats and sinking ships. The Viscount Wren's financial entanglements with Harwick became a matter of court record in the 3rd week, at which point Lady Cecily broke the engagement herself, in writing, with a brevity that suggested she had been waiting for permission. Cecily, Eleanor learned later, had known something was wrong for months. She had not known what. She was, as Eleanor had suspected, 20 years old and frightened, and not the enemy of anyone. Eleanor sent her a note. Brief, warm, careful. An introduction to a woman in her circle who was kind and well-connected, and would help Cecily navigate what came next without making her feel the shame of it. She didn't tell anyone she'd done that. In the 6th week, Lord Harwick left London. Permanently, as it turned out. The details were not made entirely public. That was the one concession Eleanor had not managed to prevent, and she had decided to accept it, because the alternative was a spectacle that would hurt more people than it helped, and Thomas would not have wanted a spectacle. Thomas had wanted it stopped. It was stopped. The Duke came to the shop on a Wednesday morning, 3 days after it was finished. Eleanor was in the back in her good chair, drinking tea and doing accounts. This was her favorite hour of the week, quiet, orderly, the satisfying arithmetic of a business that was, by any measure, working. Polly appeared in the doorway. It's him, she said, with the economy of someone who has been following a story long enough to know who him is without further specification. Eleanor set down her tea. She took her time. She smoothed her dress, which did not need smoothing. She looked at her accounts, which she had already finished. She picked up her tea and set it down again. Then she stood and walked to the front of the shop. He was standing in the middle of the room, not near the chairs, not near the door, simply standing, hat in hand, in the middle of the space she had made. He looked, she thought, more like himself than he had the last time. The diminished quality was gone. But something else remained, something careful, something that had not been there 3 years ago in the study at Ashmore, when he had read his letter and made her stand. It's done, he said. I know, a pause. I would like to take you to dinner, he said. To begin the apologies. As I said I intended to. I'm busy this evening. Tomorrow, also busy. He absorbed this. The evening after. Why don't you write to me, Alina said pleasantly, and I will see what I can arrange. He looked at her. Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. The look of a man who understood, clearly, that this was going to take a while, and had decided he was prepared for that. I will write, he said. He did. He wrote every week for 2 months. The letters were not what she had expected. She had braced herself for the particular brand of aristocratic apology that is mostly an account of one's own feelings about having done the thing, elaborate, self-referential, ultimately more about the writer than the recipient. These were not that. They were careful, specific. He wrote about the morning she had come to Ashmore the way a man writes about something he has turned over in his mind many times and is still not finished examining. He wrote about his father and what his father had tried to tell him. He wrote about Thomas, not in the broad strokes of official condolence, but in the particular, uncomfortable detail of a man reckoning with his own failure to pay attention to something that had mattered. He wrote in the 7th letter that he had asked his steward about the envelope. He told me my father wrote it the same week Mrs. Voss you came to Ashmore. That he had been watching me for some time and was not pleased with what he saw. I had thought until recently that I had a great many of my father's qualities. I am beginning to understand that I had mostly his worst ones, and that the better ones I will have to work for. Alina read that letter 3 times. She wrote back. It was not a swift thing. She had not wanted swift. Swift was for people who hadn't spent 3 years building something careful and necessary out of the wreckage of trust. She had dinner with him in the 9th week. She walked with him in the 10th. She showed him the shop, properly, not as a client but as a person she was letting into a space that mattered to her, and watched him look at everything with the attention of someone who understood he was being shown something important and was not going to waste it. He asked good questions. Not flattering questions, not the polite, surface-skimming interest of a man performing curiosity, real questions, the kind that required her to think about what she actually believed. About the work. About what she had built. About what she wanted next. No one had asked her that in a long time. What do you want next, Mrs. Voss? She had looked at him across the small restaurant table in the candlelight and thought about it genuinely. Something I've chosen, she had said finally. Not something that happened to me. He had nodded, as though he understood the difference. As though, perhaps, he was beginning to want the same thing. He proposed on a Sunday afternoon in March. They were walking in the park. It had become a regular thing, Sundays, an hour in the afternoon, and he stopped on the path and turned to her with the particular expression of a man who has been rehearsing something and has just decided to abandon the rehearsal. Alina, he said. She looked at him. I would like to marry you. The trees around them were just beginning to show green. Pale, tentative, the first fragile suggestion of spring. Alina looked at him for a long moment. No, she said. He blinked. Not yet, she said, and began walking again. He stood on the path for 2 seconds. Then he followed. When, he said. I'll let you know. He asked again in May. She said, I'm thinking about it. He asked again in August, on an evening when the light was particularly good, and she had just finished something she was proud of, and was in the kind of mood that comes from work well done, open, warm, more generous with herself than usual. She looked at him in the August light. She thought about a cold stone floor. She thought about Thomas. She thought about a tin box under a floorboard and an old man's 3 sentences and a 1/4 mile of rain and everything she had built, piece by piece, from absolutely nothing. She thought about what she wanted next. "Something I've chosen." "Ask me properly," she said. He did. On one knee, on the path outside her shop, in full view of the street and Polly, who was watching from the window with an expression of barely contained triumph. Elinor looked down at him. She made him wait exactly long enough. Then she said yes. 1 year later, the ballroom at Ashmore Estate had not been opened in 4 years. The Duke, Elinor's husband, a fact she still occasionally encountered with a mild, private sense of unreality, the way you encounter a familiar piece of furniture in an unexpected room, had suggested the gathering in October, when the leaves on the estate were doing their best theatrical work, and the house looked, in the amber afternoon light, like something from a painting that hadn't been finished yet. Elinor had agreed on the condition that she handled the invitations. He had learned, by then, not to ask too many questions when she said things like that. The guests arrived on a Friday evening. 80 of them, which was not a large gathering by Ashmore standards but was, Elinor had decided, exactly the right number, enough for the room to feel alive, not so many that it became a crowd. She had learned a great deal about proportion in the last 3 years. It applied to more things than fabric. The ballroom was beautiful. She had not redecorated, she had simply opened it, aired it, let the original bones of the room breathe. High ceilings, tall windows, the particular pale gold of old candlelight on old plasterwork. She had added flowers, late autumn ones, deep burgundy and rust, the colors of things that have lasted. The guests moved through it the way guests do, in currents, forming and reforming, the complex social choreography of people who have known each other long enough to have opinions about each other and short enough to still be interesting. Elinor moved through it differently. She had learned this too over the past year, how to move through a room that was hers. Not with the careful, measuring attention of someone calculating their welcome, but with the specific ease of a woman who has decided, once and for all, where she belongs. It had taken longer than the wedding to learn. The wedding had been a day. This had been a year. But she had learned it. She was talking to Lady Portman, who had been, in some ways, the beginning of all this, with her excellent taste and her willingness to tell people who had made her dress, when she became aware that the room had shifted. Not dramatically. Just a degree. The particular subtle change of atmosphere that happens when a group of people simultaneously notice the same thing and begin, quietly, to talk about it. She followed the current of attention to the far end of the room. Her husband was standing near the fireplace, talking to an elderly general whose opinions on everything were strong and frequently wrong. This was normal. What was not normal was what was arranged near the fireplace. 2 armchairs. Good ones, not the ballroom's usual gilt arrangements, but deep, solid chairs from the study, brought in specifically for this evening, because Elinor had asked for them specifically, and because the study chairs were comfortable and the ballroom chairs were not, and she had decided that comfort mattered more than symmetry. In one of the chairs sat Lady Cecily Wren, now Cecily Marsh. She had married a kind, quiet man from Derbyshire in the spring, someone she had chosen entirely herself and looked at. She was 21 now and less frightened, and in the middle of a conversation with the woman beside her that appeared, from her expression, to be genuinely entertaining. In the other chair sat Elinor's mother-in-law, the Dowager Duchess, who was 70 years old, had opinions about everything, and had taken to Elinor with a ferocity that had startled everyone, including Elinor herself. She was talking with her hands, which she always did when she was engaged, her rings catching the candlelight. At the foot of both chairs on the floor were the dogs. The same 2 rust-colored hounds. Older now, slower, considerably more dignified than they had been 3 years ago, though whether this was a function of age or Elinor's influence was a matter of some private debate between her and her husband. They were on the floor because Eleanor had, in her first week at Ashmore, quietly relocated their cushions from the settee to the hearthrug, where the warmth was better and the access to the fire more direct. And the dogs had accepted this new arrangement with the philosophical practicality of animals who understand that the world changes and the important thing is to remain comfortable within it. No one had asked her to do it. She had simply done it. Her husband detached himself from the general and found her at the edge of the room. He was, she had discovered over the past year, surprisingly good at finding her in rooms. She had mentioned this once, and he had looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as his most honest one, the one that appeared when he stopped managing what his face was doing, and said simply, "I've had practice. I spent rather a long time looking for you when you weren't there." She had not had an immediate response to that. She had thought about it for 3 days afterward. He stopped beside her now, following her gaze across the room to the fireplace, to the chairs, to the dogs on the hearthrug, settled and easy in the warmth. He was quiet for a moment. "You planned that," he said. "I arranged the seating, yes." Eleanor, she looked up at him. There was something in his face that she recognized, the particular expression of a man who is looking at something that costs him something to look at, and is looking anyway. She had seen it the evening on the street outside her shop, when he had said please, and she had turned around. She had seen it in different forms, throughout the careful, patient year of letters and dinners, and Sunday walks that had preceded everything else. She looked back at him steadily. "Do you remember," she said, "what you said to me?" Outside the shop. That last evening, he didn't hesitate. "Every single day." "Good," she said. She took his arm, her hand in the crook of his elbow, easy and certain, the gesture of a woman who has made her choice and is not uncertain about it, and they walked back into the room together. Nobody asked about the chairs, but everyone noticed. That was the nature of rooms like this. Everything was seen, everything was filed away, everything became part of the story that people told later about the Duke and Duchess of Ashmore and the particular quality of their household, which was difficult to articulate precisely, but had something to do with the fact that everyone who entered it, from the highest guest to the youngest kitchen maid, felt, without quite knowing why, that they had been seen, that they had been considered, that the woman who ran this house had thought carefully about where everyone should sit, and had made certain that nobody was left standing. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the house had settled into its particular late-night quiet, fire burning low, dogs relocated to the hearthrug in the study, her husband asleep with the straightforward efficiency of a man with a clear conscience, Eleanor sat at her dressing table and looked at herself in the mirror. She looked, she thought, like someone who had arrived somewhere. Not in the way she had arrived at Ashmore 3 years ago, wet shoes, borrowed courage, a dead man's letter pressed against her chest. But in the other way. The real way. She opened the small drawer of the dressing table. Inside, folded soft at the creases, were 2 letters and a note. Thomas's letter. The old Duke's note. And one more, the first letter the Duke had written to her, during those 2 months when she had been deciding whether to believe him. The one she had read 3 times and then, without entirely meaning to, kept. She looked at them for a moment. Then she closed the drawer. She had carried them long enough, through rain and cold floors and rented rooms and a baker's smell coming through the floorboards, and everything she had built, piece by piece, from absolutely nothing. She would keep them. Of course she would keep them. They were part of the story. But they were not the whole of it. The whole of it was larger now. Fuller. The kind of thing that couldn't fit in a tin box under a floorboard, that spilled out into ballrooms and Sunday walks and the particular, quiet weight of a hand in the crook of an elbow, easy and certain, in a room full of people who were watching. She blew out the candle. She went asleep. Outside, in the long corridor of Ashmore Estate, the house settled around her like something that had always known she was coming. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.